Hello and welcome to our Confessions podcast, another audio array of terrible tales from the discerning Radio 2 listenership. This week's concise collection, incredible amounts of alliteration before we've even started. A petty postal pretender, not bad. A deleted disc debacle, pretty good. A troublesome toilet trial, and a secret slippery substitute. Oh my goodness me. Who are you going to forgive? Here it all comes. It's 18 minutes to 6 o'clock. This is Radio 2, and it's a drive time confession, and we welcome the venerable Deadly, who's back, who's already decided not guilty. Why have you written down HD sound on your pad?
I was going to go away and find out what it really meant. That's what I meant.
An HD sound, does it just mean really good quality sound?
High definition.
Is that what it is? Yeah. And Sister Caroline is here for one day only.
In high definition.
Thank you very much.
High definition.
Is that how you have to say it every time?
I'll just wipe my face.
All right.
I'll do that for you, don't worry.
But it was minty and rather special. So here's tonight's tale, and it comes from Terry. Thank you very much indeed, Terry, for tonight's drive time confession. Yours to confessions@bbc.co.uk, and you can sign up to the Confessions podcast on the Radio 2 website. Dear Simon and the Caring Collective, I feel it's time to relieve a burden from my heavy shoulders. My confession dates back to 1990, when I was a young school leaver, eager to start my employment career. I saw an advert in the local paper placed by the Royal Mail looking for postmen and postwomen. A fine career for me, I thought. I went down to my local post office and collected an application form, duly filled it out and returned it the same day by hand. Sounds you didn't trust the post office. Anyway, a week later, a letter arrived asking if I could be at the main post office at 1 p.m. for what they called an aptitude test. I arrived at the post office and joined 9 other hopeful would-be distributors of Her Majesty's Mail. We took our seats in the test room and were given the test paper and a pencil and told we had 1 hour to complete it. A quick glance through revealed that there were questions about English and some questions about maths. Now, English, no problem. I completed the section with ease. However, the maths was an issue. I started to panic slightly. I was never very good at maths at school and never thought that applying for a job as a postie would require much arithmetic. I didn't know what to do. Now, on closer inspection of the test papers, I saw that they were obviously reused each time a group of applicants took these tests. Some poor chap was most probably given the task of erasing the answers with a rubber after the tests were finished, a money-saving exercise, no doubt. So I discovered that if I tilted my head to a slightly rakish angle, I could just make out the previous applicants' answers and working out. As my maths was a bit ropey, to say the least, I decided to pencil over the previous answers submitted by the person before. All went well, and I completed the test with about 5 minutes to spare. The papers were collected. We were sent on our merry way, all buzzing with the prospect of being postal distribution operatives. 4 days later, I received a letter asking me to attend an interview. I arrived and was taken to an office with 2 manager-type people. We were very impressed with your score in the aptitude test, as all management people speak like this. Out of the 30 people we had in, you scored the highest mark by a long way. In fact, you aced it. All the answers were correct. Do you think you might be a little bit overqualified for this job? Maybe a career in accountancy would be better, they suggested. Well, no, I explained, I'm an outdoor kind of guy, and seeing as I've held a paper round for the last 5 years, I know the area very well. I feel I'm well qualified for this position. A few more questions were asked. I felt I'd put myself across rather well. A week later, I received a letter, surprisingly saying I hadn't got the job, despite my standout score. Apparently, I was too smart, and they thought my talents would be better suited to something like the Inland Revenue. They needed someone more suitable to this job in hand, which you could have, if someone who can't quite get the score. Anyway, I found out later that a lad I knew from school was offered the job but was sacked 2 weeks later for failing to get up in the morning, having taken up with an exotic lady at number 26. So, well, the post, if you have a postal delivery round, who knows where it's going to take you.
Number 26.
So my career as another package. So my career as a postie was thwarted, but I've since gone on to bigger and better things in Terry's opinion. Father Sam, so I need forgiveness from the previous applicant whose work I copied in direct violation of any instructions given by various school teachers during my years there, I have to say, and from my proud parents who thought they'd produced a genius when I told them about my score in the test, and also from the lady at number 26, who I can tell you chose a bad 'un. So sorry to Mum and Dad and everyone else. Yours in absolution and on bended knee. It's Terry who needs some forgiveness. Let's see what happens.
So Terry's saying it was his fault that the lady fell for his mate who got the job.
Well, kind of indirectly, because if Terry had been slightly less qualified, he'd have got the
I
job.
think he's being a bit harsh on himself,
I think-
really,
I think-
certainly in that respect. I think it was a bit odd that the Post Office the Royal Mail sets this aptitude test, and then if you get full marks, they don't want you. I mean, how does that work?
Yes, because you would think the better you do in the score...
Exactly, the more likely you are to get the job.
Maybe, unless, when he says a few more questions were asked, I felt I put myself across rather well. Maybe he just put himself across as a bit of a jerk.
Yeah, he could have done. I
they
also
didn't
think it was
like
very
him.
odd that they just rubbed out the answers. I mean, that's a bit labour-intensive, isn't it? Why not use a photocopier and just photocopy new sheets? So for all those reasons, I think it was the Royal Mail's fault. So, Terry, you are completely forgiven.
OK, Terry, that's starting off quite well now. Venerable Deadly's...
Well, I disagree, of course, as I usually do. It's all very well him acing it, as they said. He aced it.
Yes.
Those sort of tests and whatever are to establish whether you are overqualified or not, you see. If he'd got a middling score,
Yes.
he'd have been all right. But the higher the score, they think, oh, he'll get bored with this job, so we'll get rid of him. I think he took a huge gamble in what he did, in angling his head at a jaunty angle or whatever
He
it
did.
was.
It was the jaunty angle, and if it was a particular angle, he could see the where the pencil
Yeah,
had...
he took a huge gamble and it didn't pay off.
Yes.
Sorry, basically. Sorry.
So you're not going to forgive
I'm
him?
not going to forgive him, I'm afraid.
By the way,
no.
for any younger listeners, by the way, go full mark. You know, if you've got GCSEs, A-level degree, university, higher education, don't think, well, I don't want to get full marks because then I won't get the job.
Too clever.
In general, you need to be as clever as possible.
Or just copy all the way and get them all right.
Well, no, I don't
Well,
think...
that's
I
where he
don't
went
think-
wrong, you
Is
see.
that right? What?
All good cheats know you have to get at least one wrong. So it looks
But
like
he
it was
didn't
your own work.
know. He didn't
You don't
know
know
whether they were
whether
right
they're
or wrong. He
wrong,
was just...
see?
Yeah, but then you've got to change at least one of them.
Have you?
Yes.
Do you think?
Because you might then go to right. I'm not advocating cheating.
No, not at all.
Of
Not
course
at all.
not.
We don't.
And for that reason and that reason alone, he should have got one wrong.
So therefore...
Not forgiven.
Not forgiven, OK. Tonight's from Mike. Thank you for tonight's confession. Here it is. Father Simon and the awesome archetypes. I'm troubled by a sin from my university days, half a decade ago. My guilt returns to haunt me so often, I feel unable to carry on, in denial. This one's still active. Throughout my student years, my parents looked after me very well. They took care of those difficult bills and provided a regular staycation facility for me to go back to time and time again, armed with a bin bag of crumpled clothes. At the time, I might not have properly appreciated this. Now I am critically aware of the sacrifices they made for me. My dad was not of the computer generation particularly, but he did own one. He'd recently taken the machine in for repair and been talked into an upgrade with more memory. He was like a child in a sweet shop when he discovered that his new machine also linked him to the internet. On one of my sojourns back in suburbia, I had to use my dad's computer for my essays. I did have a laptop, but had given up the ghost after I spilled a pint of lager over it. As they tend to. I mean, I think not many are lager resistant. Being nosy, I went on and had a little snooping trip through my dad's files. Now, at this point, I just want to say...
Oh, dear.
Mike, not forgiven. I mean, whatever happens from now on, it's just rude, isn't it? It's just not something that you do. Just out of idle curiosity, you understand. Imagine my surprise when I found that he had written a novel that was over 40 chapters long, a major piece of work for a novice, I'm sure you'll agree. Over dinner, I casually remarked, "So you've been doing a bit of writing, Pops?" He dismissed it by saying he'd simply been looking for something to occupy his time, though Mum told me later how he was playing this down out of modesty. He had been totally absorbed in it for years. I felt a pang of envy. I had ideas of writing a fantasy myself and obviously saw my work both on the big screen and on a gaming console. It looked as if I'd been beaten to it by my own dad. Dad had called his book Tommy's Tuck Box, which I thought was a silly title. It sounded like something out of his childhood in the 50s. I wondered if there was still a living readership for tosh like that. Just for a laugh, I dipped into it to see what rubbish he'd been writing. What a surprise I got. I read the whole book. It was fantastic. I was totally absorbed by it. I read it through in one go. Rather than a bunch of good old chaps enjoying jolly japes around the school tuck shop, the work was very modern with characters straight off the streets. The action reminded me a bit of Lock, Stock. I must admit to being a little bit envious. I had misjudged how my father's mind worked. And it was at this point that the uglier side of my persona started nagging at me. And instead of congratulating my dad, I decided to have a bit of a joke with him. Having established that he had his story backed up on a disc, I decided to amuse myself with his book, without intending any harm, you understand. I went back to the beginning and I started editing it, making his gritty street novel into a rather, shall we say, saucy camp romp. By the time I'd finished with it, the work would have been retitled 50 Shades of Pink. I felt very smug with my mischief, but when I looked back over it the following morning, I was less impressed with my artistry and decided to delete the whole thing. What I should have done, of course, is to copy the document and amuse myself with that whilst leaving the original untouched. I'd remind you that this was a time when personal computers had limited capacity, measured in kilobytes, or at best a few megabytes. The machine was slow at best, and I thought I could just amuse myself with the original document and then reload Dad's original from his backup disk. The time came for me to return to university, and I had to cover my footprint on Dad's computer, so I deleted the file I'd been playing around with and looked for the backup disk to reload Dad's book. I think everyone is doing the same as you. Hands over mouth. Imagine my surprise when I found his backup discs were not the little 3.5-inch discs I was familiar with, but big bendy 5.25-inch floppies that belonged to the previous decade. Hard as I tried to fit a 5.25-inch drive onto Dad's machine, I failed. These backups had been on the original PC. The 5.25-inch drive had disappeared on the upgrade. Oh dear. Well, my time had run out and I had to return to university. I hadn't been back in Glasgow very long before I got a desperate call from my father demanding to know what I'd done to his work on his computer. I told him just to reload his work from his backup disk, which he was not happy about. I did feel guilt and responsibility, but what can I do? I felt sure that my dad would find someone who could load the original document from the old disks and put it onto a modern disk for him. It was a couple of weeks later that I learned that his endeavours had completely failed. His backup disk had been corrupted and the file could not be retrieved. The entire work, 110,000 words, had gone. And he faced the prospect of having to rewrite it by memory or lose several years' work. Even my friend John, who's an IT geek, couldn't fix the disk. I expected Dad to treat me as the pariah, but he was very understanding, though he didn't know precisely what I'd done to his original work, and he didn't blame me for the irrational quirks of technology. The more I apologised for causing him all the trouble, the more he tried to console me, saying it wasn't my fault, which made me feel even worse. I resigned myself to the fact that I had lost Dad's book forever. Many more years have passed, but I never did fully address my guilt or tell him what I'd done. When I returned to him this Christmas, my dad proudly announced that not only had he rewritten Tommy's Tuck Box, but he developed the work into a trilogy. And he asked me if I could help set up some social networking to let the world know about his masterpiece, or rather masterpieces, that they were out there in the ether. He also assured me excitedly that as he was now semi-retired, new works were going to erupt out of him at a regular pace from here on in. So I throw myself at the mercy of the collective. Although this writing development has alleviated a degree of my guilt, I am still very much burdened. I am ashamed by the fact that I have never had the courage to confess to my dad what I did. So he knows that the book disappeared, but he doesn't know that it was because his charming son was turning it into a saucy romp. I should say at that point we removed quite a lot of what he'd actually said he'd done to the story, as it wouldn't have been appropriate. But anyway, you get the general idea. Can you imagine having written 110,000 words and the whole thing is gone? Thank you, son. What do you say, Sister Rebecca?
I think this is the most upsetting confession we've ever had, I think, in recent times anyway. That's just terrible what he did.
Years and years of years
I mean,
of work.
admittedly, he didn't intend to delete the book, but why change it anyway? Why play around with it? I mean, because he was jealous of his dad?
Yeah.
That's not a pretty trait, is it? And who knows, maybe the trilogy is better, but maybe it's not better than the original. We don't know that, do we? So I think this is a terrible thing he's done, and I know you didn't mean to do it, Mike, but I'm sorry, I can't forgive you.
I think he's right about Tommy's Tuck Box giving it.
That's a desperate title.
It's not
awful. I'm not reading a book called Tommy's Tuck Box. And what makes you think that's going to be a gritty crime drama similar to Lock, Stock? What? Tommy's Tuck Box, please. But that said, don't go sorting through your dad's computer looking at his files.
No.
That's number one. Definitely don't do that. I should flip this round. How would you feel if your son found your work
Don't even want to
on the
think about
computer
it and
and
deleted
decided
it.
to delete it?
Just-
Or turn it into a saucy romp?
Well, I don't think I'd like either. But the thought of, Years and years and years and
Yeah.
years worth
Would you
of
be
work.
as forgiving as his father has been?
No, I don't know.
No, you wouldn't, would you? No.
I don't think. But you should, now you can back up, and it's relatively easy because you can email
That's
it to
not the
yourself
point,
and all
though.
that kind of
Yeah.
If one of my children had deleted an entire book, I think it would
That would
take
be
me
it.
a long, long time to
Out
get
on your
over
ear.
it. So what do you say then?
I
Robin?
say Forgiven, because it was a very poor title. It had it coming. No one was going to buy it
So
with
it was
that
his
I
title.
love your
fault.
reasons, Matt.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Into our collective, the Venerable Deadly Staggers.
Bless you, my child.
Sister Rebecca, Brother Matthew, all here for tonight's tale, which comes from Michael. Thank you, dear Father Simon and the Honourable Collective. As we begin another year of music festivals, and the weather offers a promising indication of good, typically reliable event conditions, my thoughts return to a festival that I helped organise for 5 years. Therefore, like to ask to be forgiven for one occasion that took place back in a damp July of 2008, an event which was really quite innocent, but must have been incredibly traumatic for the one who befell the dreadful moment of terror. We were setting up for a small folk festival. The event had already run for 3 years, so preparation was now an accomplished process. The operations team were a well-oiled focus group of volunteers who proactively worked together with tight completion dates. It was a damp summer's day. Sound checks on both stages were taking place, and the beer tent testers were waiting patiently for the off. Is there a beer tent tester?
There should be.
That's a jolly good job.
Can I volunteer?
Preparations were also being made to ensure that stall holders were happy with their pitches, and food, drinks and craft stalls had optimum locations to show their wares. However, disaster struck on that Friday afternoon. My mate Leonard had the misfortune of sticking a bouncy castle where it didn't belong. It was in the wrong slot. Now, 2 guys arrived from Betty's Cakes. They wanted 2 pitches, as they always had done since 2005. But now a bouncy castle split their pitches in half. Leonard, who was beginning to regret taking on the role of operations manager, came to me for advice. He was stressed and needed assistance. Of course, it was very obvious. We would move the late arrivals to another site. Betty, of Betty's Cakes, was delighted, but for one simple demand. She didn't like the 3 portable toilets that were on the site, and they had to be moved. Moving the first 2 loos was easy. The 4 of us got a corner each, lifting and carrying the first 2. It was just blissful. But the third, well, that was a different story. It was difficult. Somehow we moved it, cursing the weight. Who knew that toilets weighed different amounts? It wobbled from side to side, and it bumped on the ground. I did drop my corner once. It skidded and lurched all over the place, and before it sat in its new resting place, skidded, which was 15 metres away. It trembled contentedly as it settled in its new position. We stood back and admired our work.
Is it alive, this thing?
The 3 pods had been moved so simply. It was when we looked at the front of the third loo that we really realised that perhaps we had prematurely moved said items with only a smidgen of consideration for anyone else. On inspection of the red engaged band that surrounded the door lock, a fear of dread and horror came over all of us. It did look as though there might have been someone in there. We took a very quick look at each other, and I have to say we ran. We split off in all directions. Leonard ran the fastest. I was hot on his tail. He disappeared behind the stalls, hiding, and in despair I ran to the stage, waving my arms like an idiot. As the evening progressed, there appeared to be no mention of any calamities or clothing requiring an expensive dry cleaning claim for that matter. However, my daughter later reported that a dear young lady had appeared in the ticket office to explain that one of the portaloos had, while she was in it, disappeared down the hill, taking her in full flight as it travelled violently, splashing that nasty blue chemical stuff around the bowl. She'd been rocked severely from side to side. Fortunately, her head had missed, on a couple of occasions, the built-in sink, but the soap dispenser had, because it was full, splashed her hair, giving her a hairstyle and an ungainly quiff. Now, this you would imagine is a small point, but anyway, they make it. I guess fortune was on our side, because her portly figure had ensured that she had remained seated, and she spoke of a slightly bruised rump. Otherwise, bar her embarrassment and shock, she was physically unhurt. This is an extraordinary image.
Absolutely. Rocked at a festival.
Apparently she left the ticket office on wobbling legs, bemused and shaken, and retired to her tent to contemplate her misfortune. So I hang my head in shame, Father Simon. I may have traumatised this poor girl to never, ever enter another public toilet. And I ask you for full forgiveness from the poor lady who got into an unexpected ride. Apparently when she sat down, she was facing north. When she came out, it was facing south and in another part of the hill, and she couldn't quite work it out. I also seek forgiveness from Leonard, who at the time was clearly the easiest one to be blamed for allowing the preschool bouncy castle to be wrongly placed, and who admitted that the preschool helpers had viciously taken advantage of his stress qualities as operations manager. He's carried the blame for many years, but I think we need to share it. On reflection, though, I seek comfort from the fact that Betty's Cakes had a record year. Well, it's a small compensation, really, because one imagines that the woman who was in the toilet when you moved it had nothing to do with Betty's Cakes. Anyway, it's the slopped blue chemical stuff that I would have thought would have been a nasty moment. What do you have
I'm not
there?
going to use the word that Matt might use, but I mean, they were a bit unobservant, weren't they? Not to notice.
That there was someone
not to notice,
inside.
number one, that there was someone inside because it was really, really heavy, and number two, that the red engage sign was activated. On the other hand, why didn't the lady inside shout?
Oi,
Exactly.
I'm in here.
Why did she just silently put up with this being carried around while she was sitting on the loo? I don't get that.
Maybe she wasn't bright
So
either.
maybe she wasn't bright either. So I think they're both a bit culpable for this. Having said that, Michael and Leonard, I mean, no harm was meant and no long-term harm was done.
Well, as far as we know.
So, as far as we know.
She might have had a fear of public conveniences.
But
Ever since.
that's manageable. So I think I'm going to forgive you.
Oh, I'm surprised. Venerable Deadly.
Absolutely, I'm going to forgive as well. I think no real harm done. I usually run the test of with or without intent to harm. No real intention to harm, was there?
All you have to do
Accidents
is
happen.
Just check the front. Is it engaged? Or say, is there anyone in there?
I don't
It's
know
not
whether they
difficult.
may have shut the door so they didn't flap open as you carry them, you see. You sometimes do
yes,
that.
yes.
You see?
Yeah,
you may
yeah,
do
yeah.
that just to make sure that they don't. You do that.
point.
That's what you do.
But if one's substantially heavier than the other, maybe
There's a bit of a
it
clue.
might occur to you.
Yeah.
But she should have... Help!
Brother Matthew.
I think, first of all, we need to address the diva-like behaviour of Betty's Cakes, who not only say we must have 2 slots together,
Yes.
but I'm not having those toilets anywhere near us.
not near cakes.
Lucky! It's a festival. You can have the toilets somewhere, and they're going to be next to your cake stall because you want your 2 slots together.
that healthy?
Unlucky. Wanting doves in the dressing room next. The other thing is, frankly, I've always been suspicious of these portable loos. I always think that...
Where do you go, then?
Well, no, I just think that it's someone's going to tip them up, obviously, when I'm on them. So I don't tend to use them. So for that reason, I am going to forgive. Because whoever goes in those loos got it coming anyway.
You're making
frankly.
that up as you went along.
I
My
was,
brother once went for a whole weekend festival without.
Really?
Yeah,
Good for him.
Because the conditions were so lousy.
There you go, you
he
see.
just didn't.
Yes, quite
That's
right.
not possible.
I'm just telling
How
you.
did he manage
I'm
that?
just telling you. How? Keep it all in. There are
Like a
ways.
camel.
They're away.
Dear Father Simon and the Forgiving Few, by the way, the Venerable Deadly has joined us again.
Thank you. Bless you for that.
Another repeat fee due.
I hope so.
We could just edit what you said last time and just drop it in. Dear Father Simon, the Forgiving Figures, I feel this is Sylvia who sends in tonight's story.
Sylvia.
I feel that a year on from my act of deception, I must finally renounce my sin and beg for forgiveness. My conscience has been pricked by the recent confession about the child who gave their sibling the poorly pet and kept the money for themselves. However, before I begin, I would just like to point out that my crime was motivated purely by not wishing to see another member of our family suffer from the bereavement of his own beloved pet. Let us take you back to the summer of 2003, the summer, when we decided to set up a fish tank in our sitting room as a little project on how to care for animals for my son Nathan and daughter Betsy. It seemed the perfect project for 2 children that didn't at that point like the unstructured time of the holidays, much preferring the routine of knowing what would happen in the day-to-day routine of term time. The tank was purchased along with all the gravel, little plants, rocks for the fish to swim around, and of course a little no fishing sign. Hilarious. Eventually when the pH levels of the water were just right, we returned to the pet shop and bought 4 goldfish. There was much enjoyment naming them, watching them swim around and seeing how much they grew on a day-to-day basis. Sadly, over the years, various fish came into our lives and then departed to the great fish tank in the sky. Various ceremonies had to take place with much weeping and wailing from the children as the little fishy bodies were interred under a bush in the garden, followed by the obligatory trip to go and purchase a replacement. Over the years, we cared for fish with no eyes, one with a deformed gill, one that swam with a limp, and one who regularly swam upside down.
That's not good.
How'd you swim with a limb?
Well, you kind of swim sideways, I think that's what.
Really?
That's uncanny.
Could so easily been one of the fish, couldn't it, though?
We could call security quickly. We now fast forward to the spring of 2012 and tragedy once more had struck. A dead fish bobbing around at the top of the tank. Husband John decided that was enough. The fish was buried and no replacement was bought, leaving just 2 fish in the tank. Nearly 9 years on from this holiday project, he'd had quite enough. However, the Easter holidays had arrived and Nathan went away to an amazing church sailing holiday. John cycled off to work as usual and Betsy and I were left at home to enjoy a restful day. On entering the sitting room, Betsy wandered over to have a look in the fish tank. To her horror, she discovered that Nathan's fish was bobbing away, dead at the top of the tank. Now, this fish had been lovingly selected and paid for by Nathan himself. He had saved for months. It was named Finley because it had a deformed fin. Yes, we know we aren't very good at choosing healthy fish, are we? Well, what were we to do? John had said no more fish, that was it, but Nathan would clearly be devastated to discover the loss when he returned from his holiday. The one remaining fish, called Nonny, short for anonymous because no one could think of a suitable name for this fish either, would be lonely swimming around that great big tank all by himself. We did the only thing that we could. We scooped the poor dead creature out of the tank, performed the ritual of burying Finley under the dead fish bush in the garden. We then gave the fish tank a good clean just to be on the safe side and raced off to buy a new fish. We scoured the tanks for the best possible replacement, had to be the right size, the right shape and of course the right colour markings. We looked and we looked until finally we spotted one that was the closest match. Maybe it wasn't quite the right size and maybe it wasn't really quite the right shape and maybe the orange and white patches weren't quite the same and the deformed fin, well, we failed there too. But hey, it would have to do. We panicked a little as we answered the shop assistant's numerous questions to check that we were indeed responsible pet owners. Eventually, though, the fish was ours and we transported our secret cargo safely home, following the instructions and introduced Finley too into the tank to make friends with Nonny. Hey, Nonny. By the time John came home from work, there was no trace of the day's illicit behaviour, and he was none the wiser. Neither was Nathan when he returned from his holiday. I told him that sometimes a fish's deformed fin grew better if it was sung to.
What? If it was sung to?
Yes.
Yeah.
We've been doing
We've
been doing a lot of singing whilst he was away. You can try that.
I think you can do it, Alan, can't you? Special way.
Yeah, I think I can.
So, Father Simon, I beg forgiveness from Nathan for deceiving him into thinking that his treasured fish's fin had gradually grown into a normal one via singing and not telling him the awful truth of Finley's sad demise. Also, I should ask forgiveness from John for going against his will. It was what he'd decided. I feel that I must also confess an added complication to the matter. On a separate occasion, we added a third fish to the tank. Whilst John was away on business, Betsy and I had once again fallen in love with a fishy friend in the pet shop. As it looked at us longingly from its tank, begging to be brought home, I said that Finn too and Nonny had had a baby.
Big baby.
Which would have been a miracle because it was a different type of fish altogether. Anyway, I plead forgiveness from the collective and hope that you will have it in your generous hearts to look beyond my deceptive behaviour and forgive an incredibly repentant transgressor.
Well.
Yeah, I mean, there are often stories of... it's a problem, you know, your kid has a pet and maybe you can replace it and the kid's not going to notice. What do you think, Sister Rebecca?
Well, I have to say that I can identify with John, the father, who was fed up with the fish. We had 2 fish that we won 4 years ago in one of those fairs, and they're still with us. And
despite your attempts at getting rid of them.
No, we haven't tried to get rid of them or anything, but I'm just getting a bit fed up with...
Do they still do them in plastic bags? Like
they do,
Yeah.
and they are surviving, and they look like they're going to survive for another decade, at least, and it's a pain, and I just want them to go to the fish tank in the sky. Sorry, fish.
That's harsh.
Oh, they can't hear
Are you
me.
the right person
They
to be
don't
doing this?
understand what I'm saying.
Can I just say, we are now hearing another side.
They know
Rebecca,
no difference.
who
Come
clearly
on.
wants her children's
I want
best.
them to die naturally.
I think we need this one next week.
Yeah.
I think
Another confession.
I'm not going to do anything to them. I'm going to carry on feeding them and cleaning their tank.
When you bring
Anyway,
them in,
it's
I'm
a pain.
shocked. I'm shocked. I don't know about you,
I
mate.
think the mother acted entirely... I mean, I think she was great. She was protecting her little son Nathan's feelings. The only problem is, where does it end? I mean, clearly they're going to have fish forever, aren't they? Because every time one fish dies, they're going to replace it, and then the other one will die, and they'll have to replace that just to save
she should
Nathan's
just send her kids
feelings.
to stay with you for a bit.
She could do that. However...
Well, Nathan and Betsy will grow up, won't they, eventually?
Yeah, but they might still want the fish. I don't know. Anyway, I think that she did it for the good of Nathan, so I'm going to forgive you, Sylvia.
For the good of Nathan.
Okay, Brother Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, we've got 2 fish at the bottom of our gut. Well, in a pond at the bottom of our gut. We've done nothing with them at all, and they're still there. And it's great because we don't feed them, we don't clean the pond or anything like that. They're still there. Pond gets frozen over, doesn't matter. They still come back. So these fish will clearly live through anything anyway. I think the point with getting the fish though is you're teaching your children important fish lessons in, you know, when they die, that's it. Fish has died, it's not coming back. That's an important life lesson. So,
yeah, but you haven't done that with yours. You've just left them at the bottom of the garden.
A bit like Rebecca, waiting for it to die. It's never these things are never going to go. They're going to outlive us.
This is a different side to the two of you.
I am going to not forgive because you need to be teaching your son that when that fish dies, that's it. It's all over.
So that's 1-1 at the moment. So the Venerable Deadly, it's down to you.
I am shocked by the two of you. I share an office with you, and this is a different side to you altogether. No real harm done. As I said last night, apply that usual principle. Done for all the right reasons. Totally forgiven.
Well, that's our collection of confessions for this week. Who did you forgive? Let us know. But most importantly, send us your own story, please. Your own confession. You know you've got one. It's confessions@bbc.co.uk, or you can go via the website. Thank you very much indeed, and more next week.